Welcome to the ABCs of Socialism political education series put on by the Central Indiana Democratic Socialists of America. My name is Jill Young and I'll be conducting our session today. This is the first in a six-part series going over the ABCs of Socialism. In this series, we'll be exploring basic questions like what is socialism, what is capitalism and how does it work? We'll also be getting into questions like, does socialism run counter to human nature? Does socialism always end in dictatorship? And why do socialists talk so much about workers? All right, so welcome everybody. Thanks for being here. We'll have time for questions at the end, so please hold them until then. Also, there's a syllabus and readings that go along with this education series, and I hope most of you were able to do the readings. We'll have questions on this PowerPoint that I'll turn to you to answer using the knowledge you gain from the readings. So when this happens and you want to answer a question, please type the word stack in the chat box. That's S-T-A-C-K. And I'll take answers in order of the stack. So let's get right into it. The first question I want to ask is, why do we do this? What is the point of a political education series like this? Socialism is by no means a new concept to Americans or to the world. It has had enormous historical significance as an idea, from the Russian Revolution and the First World War, through the Cold War, through the political revolutions of Latin America and beyond. So really, as Americans, we should already have a good familiarity and understanding of socialism. The issue I will argue is that popular conception of socialism in our country has for decades been distorted or obscured by our state and media. In other words, the history of socialism and the ideas that animate it either aren't taught in schools or talked about in the corporate media, or when they are, what we often hear are crude and inaccurate misrepresentations. So I'd like to take a minute to ask, for those who are willing to share, how was socialism explained to you growing up, at school, by family, or in the media? Do you remember your first lesson about socialism, or was it an idea that seemed to be hanging around since you can remember? So I'm going to go ahead and give my story first. Anybody who would like to share their story, go ahead and put stack in the chat box, and we will get to you. So I probably heard about socialism from my family way before this, but I remember a day in elementary or early middle school when our teacher had us do an exercise to explain the concept of socialism to us. She gave us a sheet of paper that described socialism as a system in which there is complete equality in all things, and every person has exactly the same everything. We then discussed how a system like this would be maintained by the government. And in the end, after we all concluded the system was impossible, I remember my teacher using that old cliche, socialism looks good on paper, but isn't possible in real life. Not only is it not possible, she argued, but the pursuit of perfect equality between all people is a recipe inviting authoritarianism. Now, I've since learned that describing socialism as a system which attempts to enforce equality among all people is not only a cartoonish and inaccurate mischaracterization, it's also a characterization that omits every bit of information one needs to have a real understanding of socialism. Omitted is socialism's critique of the capitalist system, which, regardless of whether or not you find socialism to be the solution to capitalism's woes, it's important to understand this critique, because for one, the grievances contained in it are self-evident once put into words, and they're not going away anytime soon. And two, these grievances explain why anyone is ever attracted to the mission of socialism in the first place. Also omitted in this characterization is the rich heritage and long list of historical figures who fought for justice, human rights, and social change under the banner of socialism. We all probably know the names of socialists like Vladimir Lenin and Leon Trotsky, but how often is it brought up that Martin Luther King Jr. was a socialist, or Helen Keller, or Albert Einstein? How often do we learn in school the contributions of socialists and communists to the fight for the 8-hour workday, the right to unionize, or women's rights? This lack of understanding colors our every encounter with the concept and makes it difficult to grasp the full context of historical events and current events going on around us. So that's my story. How about you guys? When is the first time you remember hearing about socialism and how was it explained to you?
Yeah, so I'll start. I didn't ever have like a great explanation of socialism, but I remember it coming up in conversation with some of my like older relatives and my parents, and it was always used as a sort of like a derogatory, like, oh, that's socialist or that's socialism, and the implication was always that's bad. And it was usually tied with this notion that socialism takes away your freedoms, that it's forcing you to, you know, you get what you receive and that's all you get. And maybe it's utopian that everyone gets what they need, but really it just takes away your freedom. So that was like the big thing that I grew up with as my kind of framing for what socialism was.
Yeah, definitely. Like the lack of freedom, the authoritarianism that goes along with it, and giving up something so that everybody benefits. Um, I actually can't see the chat box, so if people just want to jump in when they want to talk, that would be great, because I can't see my people stack.
This is Kerry. I grew up not too far from the first socialist experiment in the United States called New Harmony, which was founded by the utopian socialist Robert Owen. So I've had a long exposure to that community through school trips and through family trips. And it was the idea that was always taught to us, which was, you know, this idea of communalism and working for the common good were really how, you know, the very basic ways of explaining socialism to children. And then I also grew up in a very strong union household. And so my mother, while she never used the term socialist, I think had a lot of socialist values, and but never explained really what socialism meant. Socialism wasn't by any means a dirty word in our household.
That's great. Yeah, I got to visit New Harmony a couple years ago, and it was really interesting going around that town. It's a really beautiful town. The history is just fascinating. Does anyone else want to share? No
Yeah,
pressure.
I'll go ahead.
Okay, go ahead, Nick.
Yeah, I mean, I think I had a you know, education in history similar to, you know, probably everyone else, that taught, you know, the Cold War idea that socialism is bad. But kind of like Carrie, I would say, you know, being raised in the Methodist Church was actually something that maybe guided me towards those values, and the community, and like being raised in a Christian community, I think like led me to see, you know, some of the values of socialism in a good way.
Yeah, definitely. I think some of the values that we're taught growing up, sometimes we don't realize how similar, how they are fundamental or similar values to values of socialism. Does anybody else want to share? We can move on. All right, so let's get into it. Okay, so I'm hoping most of you were able to read the chapter in the ABCs of Socialism around which the presentation today is structured. It's entitled, Isn't America Already Kind of Socialist? I also hope you got to watch the lecture by the author, Chris Maizano. It's a great lecture, and in it we get the pretty hilarious admission from Maizano that much of the impetus for writing this chapter was over frustration at what he calls dumb liberal memes. Specifically, he vents his frustration at socialist snowplow memes that he says seem ubiquitous on social media every time snow season is around the corner. So here are some examples. Evil socialism at work. Brace yourselves, socialist snowplows are coming. Oh, this one's really great. The condescension is great in this one. For those of you who still don't understand, this is American socialism. Maizano's problem with these memes, of course, is that they claim snow removal is a socialist government activity and not just a basic function that any modern state would fulfill regardless of political ideology. But this article was written back in 2016, when socialism was just being popularized again by Bernie Sanders. Most people sharing these memes on Facebook back then were only baby socialists. After 2 years of Bernie Sanders campaign, after two Bernie Sanders campaigns and several years to read and develop our understanding of theory, our memes are much better informed today. I'm just kidding. I'm sure many of you saw these socialist stimulus check memes come across your feed a while back if you're on social media. They follow the same logic as the snowplow memes and drip with much of the same condescension that's always so useful in winning people to your side. But now let's turn to the whopper of a meme Maizano invokes in this chapter. The list of 50 some odd allegedly socialist programs and activities already being fulfilled by the US government. So I'm going to read this off. The Department of Agriculture, Amber Alerts, Amtrak, public beaches, public busing services, business subsidies, the Census Bureau, the CIA, federal student loans, the court system, dams, public defenders, disability insurance, the Department of Energy, the EPA, farm subsidies, the FBI, the FCC, the FDA, FEMA, fire departments, food stamps, garbage collection, healthcare, public housing, the IRS, public landfills, public libraries, Medicare, Medicaid, the military, state and national monuments, public museums, NASA, the National Weather Service, NPR, public parks, PBS, the Peace Corps, police departments, prisons and jails, public schools, Secret Service, sewer systems, snow removal services, Social Security, public street lighting, the Department of Transportation, i.e. highways, roads, and bridges, USPS, vaccines, veteran healthcare, welfare, the White House, the WIC program, state zoos, hashtag Feel the Burn. And you can see this meme was brought to you by the people for Bernie. So let's talk about the issues with this meme. Maizano talks about this litany of Maizano takes this litany of government programs and activities and parses them into a rough 4 categories. So some of these programs on this list are social services, and some have to do with income redistribution. So food stamps, the WIC program, Medicaid. Some are basic operational activities that any modern government would carry out regardless of its political or ideological orientation. So the Department of Transportation, the court system, sewer systems. Some are part of the vast apparatus of coercion or force, meaning the FBI, CIA, police departments, and the military. And finally, some seem to be thrown in for no good reason at all, like Amber Alerts, state zoos, the White House. Even Bernie Sanders seemed to embrace the logic behind this meme in 2016 when he said, when you go to your public library, when you call your fire department or the police department, what do you think you're calling? These are socialist institutions. By that logic, any sort of collective project funded by tax dollars and accomplished through government action is socialism. Well, what's the problem with this sort of logic? Maizano brings up 4 specific issues that he has with this line of thinking. Can anyone remember some of them? Or do you see any issues yourself that were not mentioned in this chapter? You can go ahead and stack in the chat or just pop right in if you want to mention something here. Nick, looks like you...
Yeah, I'll go ahead.
Okay.
Oh, wait. Well, okay. The funny thing that I would say is with dams specifically is that I think dams are almost always built to aid business interests. But yeah, I think what he says is the problem is that they don't, all of these government institutions, kind of like you've said, like don't constitute socialism. They're just really actions of government and government programs, not necessarily tied to, class struggle or the interests of the working class.
Right. Yeah, and like what you said about dams, they may be done so we can generate electricity, but it's always a private company that's doing that profits off of it. Okay, Rick?
I think one of the problems that gets brought up is how even to the extent that these programs are, socially directed, those that are, they're still beholden to the kind of like power, the determined power of private capital and investment. And so even these kind of government programs can be, I think he says, like vetoed or kind of redirected based on the undue influence of private capital and their effect over kind of everyone's lives.
Yeah, definitely. Yeah, these programs aren't safe. They can definitely be chipped away or canceled eventually by private interests.
Yeah, if I could talk again. Also, I would say the problem with this politically, and I had this problem with Bernie saying things like this too during his campaigns. I would say the problem politically is like, you know, if you're saying that the United States already has all of these programs and things in place that are socialist, then what are you saying is the problem? You know, what needs to change? You're kind of like heaping praise on the status quo, which I think is a political problem if you're running a class struggle campaign.
Yeah, definitely. For sure. Anyone else want to hop in?
One of the things he says is that, I'm just going to read it. Conflating all government action with socialism forces us to defend many of the most objectionable forms of state activity, including those that we would want to abolish in a free or just society. And what he's talking about there is the police state, the intelligence apparatus, those sorts of things.
Exactly. Yeah, that's verbatim one of the points I have on this slide. Yep, that's right. All right, if we're good with that, then I'm just going to go through it. We already talked about a lot of these, but let me list them off. So 4 of these are ones that Chris brings up in his in this chapter, and one I added myself. So this one, Carrie just said, conflating all forms of government activity forces us to defend the most objectionable forms of state activity, including those we'd want to abolish in any free or just society. This one I don't think is nearly as crucial, but it is a good thing to keep in mind. In an anti-statist country like the US, the identification of socialism with government is bad rhetorical strategy. Also, the idea that government activity is synonymous with socialism has major political and strategic implications. Also, spending on social programs may positively affect working class people, but the sheer volume of spending tells us little about the political valence of government action. And then finally, this just isn't an accurate description of socialism. Now, 3 of the issues, the ones that are bolded, we're going to be taking a closer look at on the following slides because they're definitely crucial. So the first is the idea that any government activity is synonymous with socialism has major political and strategic implications. So can anyone expand upon this? What sorts of political and strategic implications does conflating any government activity have for socialists? And you can go ahead and stack or jump right in. Looks like Rick's on stack.
Well, I guess it confines, you know, it would kind of make direct action a less valuable strategy, sort of non-state-based direct action. For, you know, if that was kind of precluded from as a socialist tactic, that would kind of throw out much of socialist strategy.
Definitely. Patrick?
As was touched on earlier, you have that whole image, especially with older people, of socialism being like communism. So then people are just comparing them and like, oh, you're trying to be like Russia or whatever and authoritarian, and so it gets skewed into the negative.
Yeah, it's that red baiting that a lot of people in the US are susceptible to. Anyone else want to hop in? All right, I'm just going to go through and have to read the points that I have here. So if our country were already partly socialist, all we would have to do is keep expanding government. We wouldn't have to change the purpose of any existing programs, nor would we have to reform the administrative structures of government agencies. Since socialist programs have been won without fundamentally challenging private property, there would be no need for a decisive confrontation with the owners of capital and their political allies. So we wouldn't have that ultimate confrontation in mind as, you know, something inevitable to our struggle. All we would have to do is elect sympathetic politicians to office and let them legislate their way to more socialism. So our second major issue with mistaking government action for socialism is that spending on social programs may positively affect working class people, but the sheer volume of spending tells us little about the political valence of government action. So let's talk about some specific programs to really explore what this means. So Chris Maizano brings up the Earned Income Tax Credit. So this program brings financial relief to the working poor, but ultimately acts as a subsidy for low-wage employers. Also mentioned is Medicare Part D, which provides some subsidies to low-income seniors, but it's widely recognized as a costly giveaway to the prescription drug industry. And Obamacare. So Obamacare increased healthcare coverage through the expansion of Medicaid. But look who profited from requiring every American to have health insurance and penalizing those that didn't: the insurance companies. So before we move on, does everyone understand what we mean by subsidies and giveaways to the drug and insurance companies? Okay, cool. So to determine if a state activity or program follows socialist principles, key questions need to be asked of the activity. We'll get into the reasons why these specific questions need to be asked as we progress through this presentation, but for now, let's just list them. So, does it increase our subordination to market discipline or offer us more freedom from its demands? Does the program reinforce or undermine does the program reinforce or undermine the power of those who own capital? Does the program strengthen the power of the working class? So let's take up our last issue with this meme, that this litany of government programs and activities just doesn't represent an accurate description of what socialism is conceived to be by its theorists or adherents. So by now you may find yourself asking, if all these programs aren't socialism, what is socialism? Well, in order to really answer that question, we need to take a quick detour and ask ourselves, what is capitalism? Now this is a topic that we'll be covering in more depth in our next class. But I've included a condensed summary here because socialism really emerged as a theory and political ideology in response to the inherent shortcomings and injustice of the capitalist system. In other words, on a theoretical level, socialism is a critique of capitalism. So you can't really talk about what socialism is without understanding the system it is critiquing and seeking to replace, namely capitalism. So let's start with a definition of capitalism. Does anyone want to give it a shot? A good definition of what we mean when we say capitalism. So this is a bit harder. Oh, go ahead, Rick.
I was gonna say I can try. I'm sure it's gonna leave out like all the important stuff, but it's the philosophy where basically labor is made as a part of a larger structure, in which a larger class can basically underpay labor relative to the products that they're creating, and then extract the surplus value from selling those products to sort of maintain the larger capitalist, the capital class above labor.
Yeah, definitely. That's a really good description of it. Anybody else want to take a swing at it? That was pretty good. So I'll just go ahead then. So capitalism is a kind of economic system. And of course, this isn't the definition. We're just talking about economic systems. So by economic system, we mean a particular way of organizing the production of goods and services in a given population. So capitalism as an economic system can be defined by three key features. So the first is, all production is carried out for selling on the market, not for self-consumption. This means that when producers make something, it is not for their own use. The main aim is the sale of that product to someone else. 2, the labor that goes into production is by people working for a wage. Another way of saying this is that the typical form of employment in capitalism is wage labor. And 3, the means of production are privately owned. This is the most critical feature of capitalism. So wait a second, what are the means of production, and why does it matter that they're privately owned under capitalism? So by means of production, we mean the productive resources and facilities used to create economic value. And this includes things such as factories, warehouses, restaurants, hotels, offices, banks, also machinery and tools, and also the land, livestock, and raw materials that go into making something. So here's more about the means of production. In capitalism, the means of production are privately owned and used to make products, items to be bought and sold to generate profit. So we kind of just went over that. And the owners of these resources and facilities are called capitalists, and the assets they own are called capital. Okay, so we're all pretty familiar with this whole setup. We live under capitalism. We interact with private businesses every day. So what's the problem with all this? Well, the private ownership of the means of production divides society into two classes: those who own the means of production, i.e. the capitalist class, and those who must sell their labor for wages, i.e. the working class. This division of classes creates an inherent imbalance of power. Because they don't own the means of production, the working class is forced by circumstance to seek employment from the capitalist class in order to get what they need to survive. And because an individual worker needs her employer more than her employer needs her, when a worker accepts any job offer, she will always be at a disadvantage if she seeks higher wages, more control over her job, or better benefits or working conditions from her employer. So in productive establishments, capitalists have full say over who gets hired and who gets fired, how much employees get paid, how long employees work and how hard, and when they work, when they don't, and what employees can and can't say, do or can't do, often wear or can't wear on the job. In other words, in a capitalist democracy, in theory, you have democratic control on the state. In theory, you have democratic control of the state through the election of representatives. And we'll talk more about that later. But within the more immediate sphere of daily life, for the vast majority, labor is performed within the mini tyranny of the workplace. So that sucks, but is that the extent of the problem? Are there other issues with the private ownership over the means of production? Well, of course there are. For one, capitalists have nearly total control over what to do with the means of production. They have the unilateral ability to decide when to move production from one place to another. So for example, a single factory or firm can be the economic backbone of a whole community. Despite this, owners and high-level managers of these private enterprises can decide to up and leave at any time it is financially beneficial for them to do so. Typically, this happens when a firm decides to move from an area of higher production costs to an area of lower production costs. Perhaps, for example, the unionization of workers in the area led to higher wage demands, or stricter environmental regulations led to more expensive waste management standards. Firms will often avoid these increased costs by moving to places with weaker labor laws or environmental regulations. Despite their greater numbers and the direct impact the move will have on them, workers, families of workers, and the rest of the community in which a firm is embedded have no say in this decision. In other words, a decision that affects the many is decided upon by the few. Capitalists also have the unilateral ability to decide which ventures to invest in and which not to. And this is a problem because capitalists will only invest in ventures that they believe will turn a high profit. Whether or not these ventures meet human need is only important so far as human need coincides with a high profit margin. So for instance, the magazine in these times had a really great article recently about how, despite frequent claims to the opposite, capitalism often stifles innovation. It specifically talked about a potential vaccine for COVID-19 that was developed 4 years ago by a team of researchers at the Texas Children's Hospital Center for Vaccine Development. This vaccine was developed for one deadly strain of coronavirus, but the team believes there's high potential it would be effective against COVID-19. Development of the vaccine stalled in 2016 when the team struggled to find funding for human trials. Of course, in the midst of the global pandemic today, you would think it would be easy for the team to finally secure funding and continue development, but it's not. Despite the already enormous toll on human life by the virus, funding for the development of this vaccine is still not forthcoming. One of the researchers said in March that they'd held conversations with big pharmaceutical companies, and that one company representative literally said to them, "Well, we're holding back to see if this thing comes back year after year." In other words, pharmaceutical companies are hesitant to invest in this vaccine because they don't yet know if COVID-19 will be a recurring seasonal illness. Recurring seasonal illnesses, like the flu, are a more attractive investment to them because they promise a client base that will come back year after year. And still, there are more problems with capitalism. This is the most important one. Capitalists have disproportionate political power. I said we'd circle back to this one because in our capitalist democracy, we are raised to believe we have democratic control of the state through the election of representatives. This tenet of our society is advanced by our educational system, our leaders, and the majority of our media. Unfortunately, however, it is simply untrue. On this slide, we're going to talk about why. So there are 3 key ways in which capitalists are able to exercise disproportionate power over our political processes. And the first one is, the wealthy are more likely to get into office, both elected and appointed. So keep in mind, the average member of Congress is a millionaire. This fact is important because the wealthy have a common set of ideas and values predicated on protecting the status quo and repressing any major challenge to that system. This is because the system as it is, with its structures and laws, is how they have built and how they maintain their wealth in the first place. 2, the wealthy exercise greater influence on people in office through political spending on campaigns and lobbying, as well as the revolving door between the public and private sectors. Now, does everyone understand what is meant by political spending on campaigns and what lobbying is and what is meant by the revolving door? If there are any questions, let me know. So these two sources of state bias, which are that capitalists and their servants literally occupy the halls of power, or they have significant influence over those that do, are forms of state capture. It has been demonstrated in Europe and parts of the global South that these 2 sources of bias can be mitigated by the presence of social democratic or labor parties that, because they are funded by their working class members, are less dependent upon wealthy patrons. However, a deeper source of state bias exists that cannot be overturned or neutralized as long as we remain in a capitalist system. This is the state's structural dependence on capital for its very reproduction. So what we mean by this, the tax revenues or debt financing that governments rely on to fund their activities are directly related to the economy and its rates of growth and profitability. To put it simply, the state relies upon taxation in a robust economy to continue to exist. Similarly, workers rely on employment at capitalist firms for the income they live on. Because of this, if a legislator seeks to keep the system up and running, meaning if they seek to continue generating revenue for the state and ensuring workers have income to buy what they need, they must ensure capitalists will continue investing in the economy. This is often called maintaining business confidence. This fact gives capitalists the ability to essentially veto any government policies they see as being against their interests. And this is kind of what Rick was talking about earlier. If the climate has been made unfavorable to business through the enactment of legislation, let's say for higher corporate taxes, increased protections for workers, or even the nationalization of some industries, capitalists will simply refuse to invest. In its most extreme form, this is done through what's called a capital strike, which is the deliberate withholding of investment in a given state, intention of spurring a recession, and therefore undermining the legitimacy and popular support of the government. In a more generalized manner, this ability of capitalists to take their ball and go home pressures elected representatives to always act in the interests of capitalists before it ever comes to decreased business confidence or divestment. Okay. So I believe this was the last point. So under capitalism, economic power is political power, and the disproportionate power of capitalists undermines democracy. So finally, let's talk about socialism. As I mentioned before, socialism arose from the observation and subsequent critique of the capitalist system. The observation was that while capitalism does not run counter to freedom and democracy in every instance, in its very nature, it generates severe deficits of both that it can never remedy for the reasons we just went over. Therefore, socialism is envisioned as a system to correct the shortcomings of capitalism and to deliver true democracy and freedom for all. Specifically, socialism is envisioned as a political economic system defined not by private control over the means of production for the generation of profit for a minority class of owners, but by the collective ownership over those means of production and the democratic decision-making of their use in order to meet the needs of society as a whole. Now, the description on the screen there, I stole that from Megan Day and Micah Utrick's book, Bigger Than Bernie, How We Go from the Sanders Campaign to Democratic Socialism. It's a really great book that I recommend checking out, and we're also reading it in our Chapters Weekly Book Club, which everyone is welcome to join Thursdays at 7 p.m. But let's take a look at this description. So they define it as a vision for a political economic system in which private ownership of the means of production is eliminated. We want the principal productive assets of society to be owned in common and run democratically by workers. We want production and work to be allocated democratically according to society's needs, performed not for a boss's enrichment, but for public well-being. We want the bounty created by that work to be shared with every member of society that creates it. And we want everyone to have a meaningful say in what society should look like. All right, so let's reiterate some basic features of a socialist system. A political economic system driven not by profit, but by human need. A system in which decisions that affect the many are decided upon by the many. In other words, further democratization of the state, as well as democratization of the workplace and economy. A system in which everyone has a right to food, healthcare, a good home, education, a good paying job, and leisure time. So let's take a minute to think about what is not mentioned in this description of socialism. Not mentioned here is perfect uniformity or perfect equality. As Professor Vivek Chibber will mention in one of the lectures assigned for a later session, perfect equality is probably not attainable, not even under a socialist system. For example, people who choose to work more will probably receive more in compensation for that work. It's just that the work being performed will be socially necessary and not done for the enrichment of a boss, and also basic needs will be taken care of. Also not mentioned here is a society free from all conflict. In fact, the expansion of democracy and the greater say of all people into how society is run will probably ultimately lead to greater debate as people begin to see they exercise real control over the political system. The key to this is that differences in opinion over governance will have their place to be hashed out, debated, and voted upon by the people in democratic forums. So let's circle all the way back around and talk about what criteria would be needed to present, or would need to be present to call a government activity or program socialistic. So does anyone want to chime in with socialist principles that state activity would need to adhere to for us to reasonably call it socialist?
A planned economy?
Yeah, so yeah, a planned economy is going to be part of it, at least partially. And there's a lot of debate among modern socialists how to balance the planned aspect, the planned economy with markets. There are still a lot of socialists that believe there are certain products that, could be bought and sold on a market, and that they shouldn't probably go away entirely. But yeah, a lot of this economy is going to have to be planned, and that planning is going to have to be decided on democratically. I think somebody had maybe done Stack in the chat. Oh, Patrick, yeah, you can go ahead.
Socialism would be the having collective control over everything, means of production being decided on democratically, things like that. Having public investments in the arts and libraries and energy and municipalizing it all so that it was run for the people instead of for profits. Yeah,
definitely. Yeah, municipalizing things. I really liked in Bernie Sanders' 2020 campaign how he argued for a nationalization of the electrical grid and not running electrical systems or public utilities, not having private companies do that, but having it be something that the public owns.
Yeah, I'll go ahead.
Yeah, okay, go ahead, Nick.
Something, we're talking about what would make a program or a function of government socialist. And I think one thing about Medicare for All that a lot of people talked about as being, a step towards socialism and, a good program that socialists should support is that it transfers power to the working class because it relieves people of having to rely on their job, their occupation for healthcare. So I think that transfer of power toward the working class is kind of a key marker of, what makes a program more or less socialist.
Yes, definitely. Yep. That's actually one of the criteria I have on here is transferring power to the working class. Anybody else, feel free to jump in. So let's see here. These are the points that I came up with. So socialist policies would be guided by principles of democratic ownership and controls of productive establishments. So you guys mentioned that. Democratic participation in the construction of government programs by both administrators and recipients. Directly democratic bodies that supplant or complement representative institutions like Congress. Empowerment of the working class through the shifting of economic and political power away from the capitalist class. And like Nick said, universal programs like Medicare for All rather than means testing. Okay then, so if all of that is socialism, what do we mean when we say democratic socialism? So technically speaking, I argue it's redundant. And the reason being, the expansion of economic and political power from a privileged few to the vast majority is socialism's fundamental tenet. And it's how socialism has been envisioned since the beginning by its foundational theorists. But if by democratic socialism, we mean more specifically the socialist movement claiming that label in the US today, we can identify predominant characteristics. So one of them is adherence to democratic internal processes and decision-making. Another is the belief in the eventual confrontation with the capitalist class in order to achieve any serious shift of power up to the working class. So this is where democratic socialists depart from the social democrats of the 20th century and just people who generally pursue reforms. We don't believe we'll be able to gradually realize socialism through reforms, or even that the reforms we do manage to achieve are safe as long as we live under a capitalist system and capitalists exercise the disproportionate political power that they do. At some point, or at many different points, our program demands a rupture with capitalism. So also we are defined by a belief in the building of power through both movements and contesting elections. So the democratic socialist movement in the United States today is defined in part by our willingness to participate in electoral politics as a way to grow and strengthen our movement. This is due in part to the fact that Bernie Sanders' 2016 campaign had such a catalytic effect and can be credited in large part for the resurgence of socialism in the US in recent years. It is a common strain of belief among democratic socialists today that electoral politics, particularly what is often termed class struggle electoral politics, are useful to our movement so long as our campaigns raise the expectations of ordinary working people, polarize along class lines against the common capitalist enemy, and promote mass working class movements outside of the state and formal elections. So another characteristic, we believe in the need to strengthen and be active members of the labor movement. For a long time, for decades, the left and the labor movement became divided, and we didn't really see as much of an emphasis on labor as, you know, the centrality of labor in the socialist struggle. And the left was sort of siloed off into more like academic institutions. And that is something that democratic socialists of today believe needs to be changed. The last point is the pursuit of non-reformist reforms that shift the balance of power from capital to the working class. So as famous revolutionary socialist Rosa Luxemburg believed, the struggle for reforms plays a major role in inspiring, educating, organizing, and empowering mass numbers of people. And the more empowered working people are in terms of economic security, the ability to access healthcare, education, housing, and food, the better their position is to demand more from their employers in wages and benefits. And this is what Nick mentioned earlier. So for example, if healthcare is guaranteed to all people as a right and not something provided by our workplaces, many more people will feel free to leave bad jobs they're stuck at because they rely on their employer provided health insurance. Okay, so thank you all for sticking through that and through the weird internet disconnection. I was going to turn off the recording now, but I don't think that I can. If anybody would like to ask a question now, or if anybody wants to add something. Oh, go ahead,
Real
Rick.
quick, I can turn off the recording, it looks like now. I'm not sure where it's going to go if I turn it off, though. Should I go ahead and stop it?
Yeah, go ahead and do it. Yeah, I should just upload it to our Zoom account.
Okay, so should I stop or pause? Sorry, I've never used this before.
Stop it.
Okay, cool.